All right, today we're going to show you how we took an abused, neglected, semi-discarded piece of walnut and turned it from a floor mat into a beautiful three-piece of furniture that would look fantastic in any living room. And here's the story of how we did that. Here's the deal. We got this 8'8" piece of 2-inch thick walnut that we have been walking on for 2 years because we don't have a good place to put it. So instead of just using it as a welcome mat to my miter saw, we've decided it's time to go ahead and cut this thing up and do something with it. So we're talking about a coffee table in the middle, or cut out of the middle, and then use the two end pieces as end tables. That way you've got a contiguous piece that could be sold as a set, maybe. But anyway, we've still got a lot of discussing to do as far as to what we're actually going to do with it. So
I don't know.
come on, talk to me.
I
You want to
think
introduce it?
no.
Would you like to do it?
I think it should have been a bathroom countertop, but we haven't committed to making a new bathroom countertop with it and
Okay.
changing the bathroom.
So
to get rid of
I'd better
it,
cut this up fast then.
so to get rid of it,
Yeah.
we need to cut it up and do two end tables and a coffee table.
So you'll quit thinking about it.
The bathroom remodel.
Gotcha. I think we can find a prettier. While we're in the background working on trying to figure out how to cut up our floor mat, wanted to mention a couple of things. Susan and I bought this slab when we first started woodworking together, and we had aspirations of making something really beautiful out of it, until we got it home and really started looking at it, that is. Now let me pause here for a second and give you a little tip. You should really look at something before you load it up and pay for it. Anyway, in our defense, at this point, Susan was just a beginner, and I was just picking woodworking back up after 30 plus years of being away from it. So we get the piece home, and we really start going over it and looking at it closer, and then we start seeing all the dings and chips on the edges and the bows and the crowns and the cracks, and we kind of just get discouraged and set our sights on some smaller projects instead. Since our shop is so small, we really didn't have a proper place to store it, so I basically just dropped it on the floor in front of my miter saw and used it for a floor mat for the next 2 years. Let's cut it. Alright, we've spent quite a bit of time looking at the possibilities with this piece of wood. We debated cutting the two end tables off the left side or the right side and leaving the coffee table just whatever happens to be left over, right? We had to look at where the damage is, look at any cracks or splits, etc. But in the end, we just decided to cut the coffee table right out of the middle. Mainly so we could maintain the flow of the grain in this piece. We figured that would be a kind of a unique selling point, actually. I mean, think about it. You're standing in the middle of your living room, looking at your couch. You got this end table sitting on the left-hand side. You got this coffee table sitting in the middle. You got another end table on the far right side. Okay, you put these together, and you've got this continuous flow of this matching grain that goes from the left all the way through, ended up in the right end table. And you can tell by looking at it that this came from one big solid piece of wood. At least that's the vision right now. And to be honest with you, we think it'd be cool as hell. So that's what we're going to try to do. Hope you come along for the ride. All the way through. That's not perfectly straight though, it got off. Shit. Oh, I know what it is, dumbass. Now what I'm trying to explain here, and to a camera that can't see what I'm talking about, is that I've set the saw blade too deep which makes the motor on the left-hand side of the saw ride up on the piece of 3/4 inch MDF that I have on the left-hand side of the track part of my so-called track saw that I've made out of scratch here. And it makes it ride up, which throws the angle off on the saw and makes it not guide properly. So that's what happened. That's why I got off on the end down there where you can see it. And also it makes for an angle which undercuts. It doesn't make it perfectly square coming off the top of the table and going down. So anyway, just wanted to show you guys that I screw up on a regular basis. But the good thing is it's easily fixed. And here comes the first end table. All right, let's talk a second about the particular type of wood that we're working with today. This is from a tree called the Eastern Black Walnut. Some people call it the American walnut because it's the most common walnut variety in the United States, I believe. The grain is going to be straighter on these Eastern varieties than it is on the more Western varieties. So while it's not going to be as crazy pretty as some of the stuff you're going to see in like a Blacktail Studio video or something like that, the plus side is I don't have to sell my truck to buy a freaking slab. Either way, though, this wood is still beautiful. And it being a little straighter grain, it actually makes for a lot more stable furniture. And here comes number 2.
Got it? Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Now that we've destroyed a perfectly good floor mat, we might as well see if we can make something pretty with the pieces that are left over. And hey, if not, I can just glue all these pieces back together and have a shorter, slightly thinner floor mat that I can throw back in front of my miter saw. It's always good to have a backup plan. Now we're at the part where we have to start trying to figure out how to turn all of the wood's imperfections or defects into positives, right? So we need to figure out how to turn the cracks, the dings, the cuts, and the holes into something that enhances the beauty of the wood instead of detracting from it. Now there are some defects in wood that you just can't turn into a positive, like cupping, for instance. Cupping for me is definitely a negative. What I'm trying to do is build something flat, and if you've got something that's warped or cupped or bowed or whatever, then that's definitely your enemy, and you're just going to have to work around it. You've got to figure out the best way to limit the negative effects of something like this. Now, as you can see here, I'm going to lose almost 3/16 of an inch, and that's just off the top. So you've got to double that. So I've started out with a 2-inch piece. I'm going to end up with almost 1.5 inches already right off the bat. It's going to be down to 1.5 inches. So I have to be really careful about what I do so that I don't lose even more. Normally, this is what I would do first to a slab. That way you've got a flat, stable surface, and you can actually use less epoxy because the volume of the voids that you're going to be filling is going to be necessarily smaller since you flatten the piece. However, in this instance, we're not worried about the epoxy. We can waste some of that. What we can't waste is the thickness of the board. So instead of flattening it first, we're going to reverse the order. We're going to pour the epoxy on these untouched slabs. We'll have to finagle some stuff around and stuff like that, and it might get a little tricky sometimes. But we'll do that first, and then we'll flatten the slab, and we'll just do it one time. Therefore, we don't have to make 2 passes on it. So we're going to save a little bit. It might just be a 1/16 of an inch, but whatever it is, we'll take it. Now, I kind of jumped ahead here and gave you a little preview of the epoxy pour, but we've actually got quite a bit of work to do before we ever get to that point. So let's rewind and get a little more in depth on this. Now, believe me when I tell you this. Instead of jumping through all these hoops to have to try and save a 1/16 of an inch here or there, I would much rather start out with a 3-inch slab. That way I'd have all the room I needed to play with. But our options in that respect, around here at least, are limited. And I like my truck too much to be ordering slabs from Oregon. I think I mentioned earlier how disappointed we were when we first brought this slab home with all the imperfections in it. But you know, after 4 years of working on other things and other smaller imperfections and stuff like that and learning, we realized that these imperfections are gold. And if you have a little bit of knowledge like Susan and I do, and a whole lot of patience like Susan does, then it's amazing what you can do with this stuff. So let's have a look at some of this potential gold now. This is actually the biggest imperfection in the entire set of boards, but it's probably the simplest to fix actually. All we're really going to have to do is clean it up with a wire brush to make sure there's nothing loose in there, whatever is going to float up in the epoxy, etc. And then we're going to end up taping up the ends and pouring the epoxy, which I believe you've actually seen a little preview of already. Now on the back side of it, just basically that's going to come later with sanding. And Susan is going to fix that live edge like nobody's business. Alright, next up is our little star pattern crack, I guess is what I would call it anyway. That's what I think of when I see it. And it's not going to take a lot of work. You have to blow it out real good and clean it out as much as you can with the picks, and make sure there's no debris or anything in there that's going to float up, and take care of little stuff like this piece right here that's kind of semi-loose but doesn't really want to come out. It's small enough that I think I can force it into the position I want it in, and then pour the epoxy, and it's going to stay. It's not going to cause any issues because it's not going to put a lot of force on the epoxy or the wood. So anyway, this one's a fairly simple fix, and I think this could turn out really pretty. This could be a real highlight in the wood. Last but definitely not least, as far as being a total all-around pain in the butt, is this through hole that we have going from top to bottom in this second end table. The top is not too bad. The bottom, as you'll see, is gonna be a real pain to work. But being a real pain doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing in the end, because it could turn out to be the prettiest part of this entire set. Alright, what we're gonna do now is start prepping these things with a little water-based polyurethane. There's 3 reasons that I like to use a water-based poly to pre-treat before I put the epoxy in these things. It's cheap, it's thin, and it dries fast. Oh, and don't forget, I said water-based poly, not oil-based. Oil-based doesn't mix too well with epoxy. I also wanted to mention I'm only using this as kind of a sanding sealer almost, like a pre-seal coat. This wood has been drying for a long time, so it's especially thirsty. So I'm using something cheap just to fill in the voids as quickly as possible. Now, water-based polyurethane, while it seals pretty well, one coat is not going to make a permanent seal. And that's not really what I'm using it for anyway. I'm using it more like a primer. So I'm following up now with a coat of deep pour epoxy. Now the reason I use the deep pour is it's thin, it spreads well, doesn't cause any bubbles, it seals like a champ, and it has a slow drying time, which gives you a wide window in which to make your final pour. When I say window, let me explain myself a little further. There are two types of bonds that a seal coat and a main epoxy pour can make. There's a chemical bond, and then there's a mechanical bond. Now, the chemical bond occurs during the window. And what happens is you wait until the seal coat is starting to dry, but it's still tacky, and before it starts to get hard to the touch. And during that process is the window. And you can make your pour then. You make a chemical bond, which the two epoxies actually fuse a little bit. Now, if you wait past that, what you have to do is wait until the epoxy is really hard, the seal coat, and then you scratch it up with some sandpaper and make sure you've got 80% of it scratched up. And then you make your pour, and that makes a mechanical bond, which actually gives the epoxy you're pouring, the liquid epoxy, a way to grab a hold of the seal coat and make a bond. And they're both powerful. I've never seen either one break. So it really doesn't matter. It's just that the chemical pour is just a little cleaner and faster. You don't have to do the sanding and the cleanup that follows that. So I just wanted to make that clear. When you're working with non-dimensional lumber, you're going to learn pretty quickly that every single piece is different. You've got to learn or even invent new techniques for making the wood and the epoxy do exactly what you want it to, or pretty often just dealing with it when the wood and epoxy has a different idea than you do. Take this situation, for example. Now I have to figure out a way to keep these through holes that go all the way through the wood from leaking when I pour the epoxy. So what I had to do was I came up with this idea to put caulk all around the bottom holes and then just use pieces of plastic to hopefully hold the epoxy in. I've never actually tried this on a hole this big, or holes this big, I should say. So we will just see how it goes. You're also going to notice me doing some sanding here. The reason is I missed my window and I let the seal coat get hard, so I had to go in and sand it. And you're going to see I have to sand it and clean it up and all that good stuff. And all the extra stuff I'm doing is why I try and hit the window, why I try and make a chemical bond instead of having to make a mechanical bond. So anyway, just wanted to show you that. Now we're at the point where we need to figure out how much epoxy we're going to mix up. Because this stuff's pretty expensive, you want to at least get in the ballpark. You're going to see that can be pretty difficult sometimes. There is a formula for figuring this out, and it's the average width times the average depth times the length divided by 1.805. This will give you your total epoxy needed in fluid ounces. Now, the problem comes in when you're trying to figure out the average depth and the average width, because it's a mixture between measuring and guessing. So it's best to call it guessuring, because it's more art than it is science. But at least you can get in the ballpark, and you're probably not going to waste a lot of epoxy. Now comes the beginning of the fun part, at least for you guys. It's always fun to watch epoxy pour, but for the person pouring it, a lot of times it's kind of tense because you've got to watch for leaks, and they can really, bite you in the rear end. You can end up gluing your work table to the floor of your shop unintentionally and permanently. So you guys go ahead and enjoy. Okay, I'm going to give you guys one more little hint on the epoxy. Now I've put my epoxy in, the initial mixing is done. That looks pretty dang thick and pretty, right? Really deep blue. But the problem is that you're looking through 4 inches of color, pigment. So what you need to do is figure out about what your average depth is going to be and how colorful you want that. You know, how clear do you want it? So what you can do is, over here I'm gonna have about a 1/4 inch of depth. So I'm gonna pour out about a 1/4 inch in this cup over here, right here, just to get an idea of what it's gonna look like. Okay. Now, there's a 1/4 inch. Let's put it over this pen, for example. Okay? That's how blue it's going to be at the average depth of this side over here. Got it? Now, as opposed to having looked through it before, see the difference? So you got to figure out, I don't think this side is quite blue enough for me. I'm going to want it a little more blue. Well, my wife concurred that it wasn't quite thick enough, so I'm going to add some more. As you can see, it's not a whole lot. But when it comes to pigments, a little goes a long way. Anyway, we do this for about another 5 minutes, and we'll be ready to pour. One thing I wanted to remind you guys about, I had mentioned earlier in the video that I wasn't going to level the slabs right off the get-go because I wanted to save as much finished thickness as I possibly could by leaving it unlevel, etc. Well, you're going to notice during the pouring of this thing that I have to move it back and forth, and multiple times you're going to see the epoxy go one way and then it's going to go the other. That's me having to adjust the slab for the optimal pour, that, you know, where I can get the most epoxy in there and save the most thickness. It's kind of hard to explain, but believe me, in the long run, it makes a difference. One other thing I wanted to mention, while this epoxy pour here on the video takes about 2 minutes, this took multiple days. I can't remember, it might have even taken a couple of weeks to finish, because I had to make multiple pours. I had to come back with some tabletop and do some finishing off as well. You're going to notice that I definitely missed my initial measurement, as I would say. It was somewhere between not even close and pretty far off. So anyway, hey, when I said my measurements would get you in the ballpark, I didn't say that ballpark wouldn't be the size of Dodger Stadium. Now that the initial pours have been done on the slabs, it's time to flatten them. And since the biggest planer that I have is a 13 inch, I can't afford anything else right now. And there's nowhere locally that I can rent time on a machine. I have to use my own homemade planer jig. And to do that, I also have to have a flat work area large enough to do that. And since this video is going way longer than it should at this point, we decided you guys probably wouldn't mind smoking through that real fast. So this is our homemade planer jig. They can handle up to 40 to 42 inch wide pieces. So it'll do a dining room table if I need to. It's just some cheap angle iron and some scrap wood and some bolts that I had laying around. And on top of it, I've got this cheap 1/2-inch plunge rider, a Win, and it's been surprisingly effective and reliable, actually. All right, guys, here we go. I'll mask up and see if I can get this thing rolling. Get some good hearing protection on them. And see what we can do. Here we go. Or maybe not. And the router's not working. Of course. Well, that's what you get for using cheap shit, I guess. All right, let's see if we can figure out what's going on with this thing. I honestly don't know what the hell I did to fix this thing. So fingers crossed, and let's hope it lips to the rest of the video. All right, one thing I do want to say. If you are going to plane, which we have one side of this slab like this, if this thing has been sitting here for a couple of years or 4 like this one has, it's going to build up almost like a bark on the outside of it, right? It's going to prevent moisture from coming in, etc. to a degree. And when you plane one side of it, it's going to open those pores up like we've planed the other side of this one already. Now, if I was to leave this thing tonight in this humid environment that we have here in East Texas, there's a good chance that when I come in the morning, this thing will have soaked up water on the other side of it and swelled, which will actually cause a bow or cupping or all kind of weird shit that goes on with this. So one rule is, especially on larger pieces of wood, if you plane one side, you need to plane the other the same day, okay? Or you will have issues. It's a hard lesson to learn, so keep it in mind. All right, let's get set up for this other one, other side. This is going to be a really pretty piece. Look at this. Isn't that amazing? The epoxy, it has to be touched up, but it will come out very pretty, I believe. Same side on the edge over here. Look at the grain and stuff around that. That is just beautiful. That's really going to pop. All right, good morning. Now, what we're going to have to do today is get this thing sanded down. As you can see, or at least I hope you can see through the lens there, this thing has a lot of ridges in it from where I use my homemade planer on it. So these things are really tough to nail down or to sand down with a random orbital. It takes a long time. So anyway, I'm going to cheat, run it through my drum sander. However, this thing is a little bit too wide to go through to keep running it through in one direction. So what I'll end up having to do is tilt the bed on the thing just a little bit so that it'll sand like 3/4 of the way across, and then it'll come up like so. And then I'll have to take the board and flip it around and run it back through the other way so it sands this way. So there'll be like a micro crown in the middle of this thing when it's done. But it is definitely the fastest way to knock these ridges down. So let's get to it. I'm going to mark it with some chalk all the way down, so that when I run this through, we'll be able to see where that drum is coming off of the edge of it. And I can adjust from there. Now we're going to repeat the process with the end tables. Look at the marbling in here, quilting, I guess you'd call it. The colors. Beautiful, beautiful black walnut right there. Now, here's the cool thing about this coffee table and 2 end table set. I don't know how well you guys can tell, but it matches up just beautifully. This flow is exactly what I was imagining when I first started this project. To me, it is absolutely gorgeous. Now, if you'll notice on these edges, these slabs have been damaged in the past, like this one right here. Of course, you can see where it's indented right there. We've got one across the way over here, as you can see. Now, what Susan will do, or me, but she's actually better at the edges than I am, is she's going to repair those with a blue epoxy. So hopefully what you'll see here is a little blue coming out right here, and it'll actually add an accent, a couple of accents. Anywhere there's damage like that, we'll fill it in, and it really adds to the pieces. This thing, you're starting to be able to see what it may look like when it's finished. All right, what we're going to be doing now is turning all of these dings, dents, and assorted damage from blemishes to beauty marks. This can be a real value add where most people would look at it as a problem. We look at it as a potential opportunity. Now, while we're only going to show you a little bit of this prep work now, be aware there are hours and hours and hours involved in getting this stuff ready for the epoxy, and then more hours getting the epoxy shaped and formed and brought into the flow of the wood. Not sure if you noticed the crutches in the background, but my wife, my beautiful Susan, had to have surgery about 3 or 4 days ago, and she's right back at it. Just can't keep her away from it. No rest for the wicked. And now we go from repair prep to epoxy.
Are you not going to start filming it?
It's filming now.
Okay.
At this point, if you've stuck with us this long, we would like to invite you to subscribe and ask that you give us a thumbs up. We'd definitely appreciate it. Unless you think we suck, and then just go away. Go ahead, click off. Bye. See you later. All right, what we're doing today is taking off the tape from the epoxy repairs that Susan made the other day and see if we're going to have to add any more epoxy or adjust or what kind of sanding we're going to have to do with this. Now we start the shaping process. This is where we're going to get the epoxy to flow along with the wood and trick your eyes into believing it actually belongs there. Now you're starting to see the epoxy repairs take shape a little bit and kind of give you an idea of what they're gonna look like. This is really gonna be a beautiful piece of wood, and I say that from experience. Just wait until you see it with the Rubio on it. And starting now, you're about to get a really good idea of what this thing is gonna look like in the end. What we're doing here is called popping. And what you have to do is you spray this thing when you get to a final grit, or you can actually do it on every grit if you want to, and I think that's overkill personally. So spray it with water after you've sanded with the final grit, and it makes the grain pop up and stand up. Now let it dry, and this thing will be fuzzy feeling. And then you sand it again, and what happens is that later on, if water gets in contact with the wood, it's not going to make it pop or swell up or anything like that. It's really, really important to do it with cutting boards and stuff like that that's going to be washed and have water on it, but we always do it for our tables as well. Now, if I didn't spray this right here, it would cause a stain like we saw before. So you've got to keep this thing wet over the entire body. For obvious reasons, this is one of the most satisfying parts of the build. It's always a wow moment, and sometimes it's actually breathtaking. After we're done wetting these down, aka popping them, it raised the grain on them, so we did a final sand at the final grit, which is 180 in our case. And then we blew it off really well and went over it lightly with a tack cloth. And now it's time to seal that beauty in. On our walnut and mesquite pieces, we almost exclusively use Rubio Monocoat. Now Rubio says you only need one coat, hence the name. And while one coat may offer the protection you need, we always put two coats because, man, that second coat really makes that grain pop. And I mean pop in a good way. Now I think I'll just let the wood speak for itself. Now I'm going to slow down right here, and I want to show you something from an earlier part in the video where I was talking about a piece on the bottom of this particular end table, and then I would like to bring you back and show you that part today. So here's that clip from earlier in the build. The bottom, as you'll see, is going to be a real pain to work, but being a real pain doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing in the end, because it could turn out to be the prettiest part of this entire set. And the proof's in the pudding. And I do promise that I made those comments long before we ever reached this point right here. Now I'm not going to make you watch the application of the second coat, simply because it goes on exactly. It's identical to the first coat, and there's no use wasting time on that. Just be aware that when the second coat is done, it's a little darker, but then it goes through a 1 to 3 week long curing process, and it's not like an immediate change after that. But during that cure time, it develops a deep luster, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. The camera can't really catch how pretty it is. Or to be more accurate, any camera that I'm manipulating can't capture the true beauty of this furniture. Now, as I'm sure you've also noticed, these things are legless. So here's the story on how we remedied that. Now, normally we like to go with metal legs from somewhere like floyline.com or some similar site. But in this case, we decided to use legs that we had built out of the same local walnut as the tops were made from. Now, we're not 100% sure if the legs are from the same exact tree, but the lumber was purchased at the same time from the same small supplier, so there is a good chance that it actually was. If not, at a minimum, it all came from the same river bottom in East Texas. So anyway, to make a long story even longer, our neighbors came over about a week before Christmas, something like that, and they were looking for some last-minute Christmas gifts, etc., and the wife just fell in love with the coffee table set. So anyway, her husband contacted me shortly after they left and said he wanted to surprise his wife with the whole set for Christmas. We made arrangements for us to keep the pieces at our place until he could pick them up on Christmas Eve day, since he had no way to get them past his wife and hidden somewhere before then. So since I had a week or so to film how I was going to attach the legs to the tops, I spent the next several days just meticulously planning out in my head every detail of how I would film the leg portion. And just an aside, Susan came up with a word to describe this Zen-like mental exercise that I've perfected over the years. She calls it procrastination. But that's neither here nor there. So now my schedule has me set to finish filming on the 23rd, which gives me a full day to spare for delivery. So that should, not be an issue. So I'm sitting around on the 22nd, I'm sure mentally planning some other project, when my neighbor calls out of the blue and says that his wife has unexpectedly decided to go somewhere and that he has a window of about 4 hours in which to deliver the furniture down to his place and get it hidden before she returns. So now, due to my planning, all the plans for filming a detailed explanation of attaching these legs just went smooth out the window. So all you get to see is me putting on the last leg, bolting the last one down, and then taking a little video of the finished product. Anyway, I'm lucky at least that it was a rainless, sunny day, so I could at least get some video of what everything looked like as a finished set. Even though my planning didn't quite work out this time, at least I know that this beautiful, unique set now has a loving home, and we've documented exactly how you can go from a floor mat to fine furniture. And if you'd leave your opinions in the comment section below, we would truly appreciate it. Thanks for hanging with us to the end, and we will see you on the next video.